May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The guns went silent across Europe, but in the frigid waters off the Norwegian coast, one submarine was still running. U-864 had left Bergen 2 months earlier under orders that didn't appear in any logbook. Its destination, Japan. Its cargo, 67 tons of steel, mercury, and optical glass, materials for weapons that could still turn the Pacific War. And according to fragmentary intelligence intercepts that surfaced decades later, something else. Something small, dense, and valuable enough that 3 officers on board had been handpicked by the SS. The boat never made it. On February 9, 1945, a British submarine detected U-864 creeping along the seabed near Fiji Island, trying to slip through the North Sea unnoticed. HMS Venturer fired 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern, aiming not at where the U-boat was, but where it would be. The 4th torpedo struck amidships. U-864 broke apart and sank in 250 feet of black water. All 73 men aboard died. The cargo went down with them, and for 80 years it stayed there. But cold water preserves things. Steel, mercury, secrets. In 2003, Norwegian authorities began monitoring the wreck after detecting mercury leakage into fishing waters. The cargo manifests had listed mercury, liquid metal used in detonators, but no one knew how much had survived in intact canisters or how much was seeping into the ecosystem. Environmental surveys suggested the wreck was a ticking chemical time bomb. Plans were drawn up for containment, possibly encasing the entire wreck in concrete and rock. But then the intelligence files were declassified, and the story changed. British Naval Archives released intercepts from early 1945 showing that U-864 had made an unscheduled stop in Kiel before departing for Norway. Crew manifests showed 3 Waffen-SS officers on board who had no technical or navigational role, and a dispatch from Bletchley Park, translated from a fragmented Enigma message, mentioned a special consignment loaded under guard in the final days of the Reich, something intended not for Japan's war machine but for future operational security. That phrase, operational security, was SS code. It didn't mean weapons. It meant leverage, insurance, gold, the kind of gold that could buy silence, new identities, and passage to South America. Before we go further, take a second to subscribe, because every week we uncover the wrecks, the vaults, and the depths where history tried to hide what it couldn't afford to lose. By 2018, the Norwegian Coastal Administration and NATO's explosive ordnance disposal units had a problem. They needed to stabilize or remove U-864 to stop environmental contamination. But if the intelligence was accurate, this wasn't just a cleanup job. It was a recovery operation, and recovery meant divers. The North Sea off Fiji is not forgiving water. Average temperature 4 degrees Celsius. Visibility less than 3 meters on a good day. Current strong enough to pull a diver off the wreck and into open water, and the wreck itself, twisted, unstable, filled with unexploded ordnance, corroded pressure hulls, and decaying mercury canisters that could rupture if disturbed. The kind of environment where one mistake means hypothermia, decompression sickness, or a body that's never found. The Norwegian Navy brought in its best, combat divers from Marine Jägerkommandon, trained for deep cold water operations in Arctic conditions, but they needed support. The wreck was too deep, too dangerous, and too politically sensitive to risk without backup. NATO requested U.S. Navy assistance. Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 2, MDSU-2, was deployed from Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek in Virginia. Their specialty, deep salvage, explosive ordnance disposal, and underwater structural assessment. They'd recovered aircraft from the ocean floor, cleared mines in the Persian Gulf, and mapped sunken ships in water so dark you navigate by touch. But this was different. This wasn't a plane or a mine. This was a submarine, a war grave, containing the remains of 73 men and possibly the last liquid assets of the Third Reich. The mission brief was clear. Assess structural integrity, locate and secure mercury containers, document the cargo hold, and, if intelligence proved accurate, recover any anomalous high-density materials consistent with precious metals. They didn't say gold in the briefing, but everyone knew. The dive team arrived in Fiji in March 2019. The weather was brutal. North Atlantic storms had been hammering the coast for 2 weeks straight. and sea state forecasts showed another low-pressure system rolling in from Iceland. They had a 6-day window before conditions became impossible. The operation required a surface support vessel anchored directly above the wreck site, with mixed gas dive systems, decompression chambers, remotely operated vehicles for preliminary survey work, and a mobile lab for immediate analysis of recovered materials. The Norwegian Coast Guard provided the vessel, KV Stormbull, a 70-meter patrol ship retrofitted with A-frame cranes and saturation dive capability. The first ROV pass revealed what sonar had already suggested. The wreck was worse than expected. U-864 had split into two main sections on impact. The bow section, containing the forward torpedo room and crew quarters, lay tilted on its starboard side, partially buried in sediment. The aft section, which included the engine room and cargo hold, had collapsed inward when internal pressure equalized with seawater. The conning tower had sheared off entirely and rested 30 meters away. Debris, steel plating, piping, personal effects, was scattered across a 100-meter radius, but the cargo hold was intact, or at least parts of it. The ROV's cameras captured rows of cylindrical steel flasks, each about a meter tall, stacked in what had been watertight compartments. These were the mercury containers. Some had ruptured, silver liquid pooled in the bilge, thick and gleaming under the ROV's floodlights, but deeper in the hold, beneath collapsed decking and twisted frame members, the cameras picked up something else, rectangular, metallic, stacked, a grid pattern, too uniform to be cargo, too deliberate to be equipment. The team ran spectral analysis on the ROV's imaging data. The material reflected light in a wavelength consistent with non-ferrous heavy metals. Density estimates, based on how the objects had settled into the sediment, suggested they were far denser than steel or brass. Gold has a density of 19.3 grams per cubic centimeter. Lead, 11.3. Steel, 7.8. The readings came back at 18.9. Close enough. The first manned dive went down on March 14, 2019. Two divers, Lieutenant Commander Eric Halvorsen, Norwegian Navy, and Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tran, U.S. Navy. Both had logged over 500 deep dives. Both were trained in closed-circuit rebreathers, which recycled exhaled gas and left no bubbles, critical for working inside a wreck where disturbed sediment could turn visibility to 0 in seconds. They descended on a weighted line, dropping through green water that turned gray, then black. At 50 meters, the thermocline hit. Water temperature dropped 2 degrees in as many seconds. At 80 meters, they reached the wreck. Halvorsen later described it in his debrief. You don't see the whole boat. You see pieces. A curve of hull, a hatch, something that used to be a ladder. It's like walking through a building after an earthquake, except the building is underwater and made of steel that's been rotting for 80 years. They moved carefully, clipping safety lines to stable frame members. As they went, the cargo hold entrance was partially blocked by a collapsed bulkhead. Tran used hydraulic cutters to shear through corroded bolts, while Halvorsen steadied the section with a lift bag to prevent it from shifting. It took 40 minutes to create an opening large enough to enter. Inside, visibility was less than 1 meter. They worked by helmet light and hand signals. The mercury flasks were still secured in their racks, but the racks themselves had corroded. Some flasks had tipped and spilled their contents. The divers avoided direct contact. Liquid mercury is toxic, and even through neoprene gloves, prolonged exposure is dangerous. But behind the flasks, wedged against the aft bulkhead, they found the crates. Wooden, reinforced with steel banding, stenciled markings in German. Sonderkommando, nicht öffnen, special command, do not open. There were 12 crates, each roughly half a meter square, each heavy enough that even underwater, where buoyancy reduces effective weight, it took both divers to maneuver one onto a lift bag. They secured the first crate, inflated the bag, and sent it to the surface. Then, the wreck shifted. No one knows exactly what caused it. Maybe the divers disturbed load-bearing sediment. Maybe a current surge destabilized the hull. Maybe the steel, weakened by 80 years of saltwater corrosion, simply decided it had held long enough. But something in the aft section let go. Halvorsen heard it first. A low groan, metal under stress, resonating through the water. Then a crack, sharp and percussive like a rifle shot. The decking above them sagged. Sediment billowed in a choking cloud. Visibility dropped to 0. Tran keyed his radio. Surface, we've got structural failure. We're pulling out. They moved by touch following their safety line back toward the exit, but the collapsed bulkhead had shifted again, narrowing the opening. Halverson squeezed through. Tran didn't. His rebreather harness caught on a jagged piece of frame. He pulled. The frame bent but didn't release. He could feel the wreck settling, pressing down. He pulled harder. The harness tore. He was through. They surfaced 40 minutes later, ascending slowly to avoid decompression sickness, stopping at predetermined depths to off-gas nitrogen. When they finally climbed aboard Stormbull, they were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. The first crate was already on deck. The team waited until they were back in port to open it, not because of protocol, though protocol required a controlled environment, but because no one wanted to crack a crate marked by the SS in the middle of the North Sea with a storm rolling in. They opened it in a secure facility in Bergen, under observation by Norwegian intelligence, NATO liaisons, and a historian from the German Federal Archives. Inside, gold bars, not coins, not jewelry, bars, stamped with Reichsbank seals and serial numbers. Each bar weighed approximately 12 kilograms, about 400 troy ounces. 30 bars per crate, 12 crates recovered, 360 bars, nearly 4.5 tons of gold, at 2019 market value, roughly $250 million. But the serial numbers told a darker story. Cross-referencing with looted asset databases maintained by the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, investigators determined that the gold had been seized from central banks in occupied territories, Belgium, Netherlands, France, and melted down to remove identifying marks. The Reichsbank had done this routinely in the final years of the war, converting looted gold into fungible bars that could be traded or hidden. This gold wasn't payment for weapons. It was an escape fund, a final hedge for officers who knew the war was lost and planned to vanish when it ended. But they never got the chance. The legal aftermath took longer than the dive. Norway claimed salvage rights under maritime law. Germany argued the gold was state property, looted during wartime and therefore subject to restitution. Belgium, Netherlands, and France submitted claims based on archival records matching serial numbers to pre-war central bank reserves. And the families of HMS Venturer's crew, who had sunk U-864, argued that British action had made the recovery possible. It took 4 years of litigation. In the end, the gold was divided. A portion went to Holocaust restitution funds. A portion went to the nations from which it had been stolen. A portion went to Norway for environmental remediation costs. And a small portion, 10 bars, went to maritime museums in Britain and Norway, where they remain on display alongside artifacts recovered from the wreck. The mercury was never fully removed. In 2023, the Norwegian government approved a plan to entomb the wreck in a rockfill sarcophagus, sealing U-864 and its remaining cargo beneath thousands of tons of stone. The environmental threat is contained. The wreck is now a war grave, protected under international law. But the story didn't end there, because gold, as it turns out, was not the only thing hidden in those crates. When archivists examined the recovered bars more closely, they found discrepancies. 3 bars had hollow cores, sealed with gold plugs so precise they were invisible to casual inspection. Inside, microfilm canisters. The film contained documents, financial records, lists of names, account numbers and addresses in Switzerland, Argentina, and Spain, safe houses, contacts, escape routes. The SS had prepared for defeat. They'd built a network, Die Spinne, some historians call it, the spider, designed to extract high-value personnel and assets when the Reich collapsed. The Goldie was part of it. But so was the information, and that information was more valuable than metal. Intelligence agencies across Europe are still analyzing those documents. Some names on the lists matched known war criminals who evaded capture and lived under assumed identities for decades. Some matched bank accounts that were never frozen or investigated, and some matched companies, still in operation today, that have no recorded connection to the Nazi regime, but whose ownership structures trace back to entities listed in those microfilm canisters. The divers didn't know they were recovering evidence. They thought they were recovering gold. But history, like the North Sea, keeps things cold and intact until someone is brave enough, or desperate enough, to go down and bring them back. The recovery of U-864's cargo raised questions that went beyond salvage law and restitution claims. It forced historians, intelligence analysts and forensic accountants to reconsider what they thought they knew about the end of the Third Reich, not the collapse itself, but the machinery of its dissolution. Because empires don't just fall, they liquidate, and the SS had been planning liquidation long before Berlin burned. The microfilm documents recovered from the hollow gold bars revealed a network that operated like a modern offshore trust, except it was built in the chaos of 1944 and 1945, when borders were fluid, records were burning, and entire governments were in exile or under occupation. The list contained over 400 names. Some were SS officers, some were industrialists, some were bankers who had managed Reichsbank assets and knew where the money had gone. But the most disturbing entries weren't names. They were references to active holdings, assets that were still generating income after the war ended, real estate in neutral countries, patents registered under shell companies, gold deposits in vaults that had never been inspected by Allied investigators. One entry, flagged by German Federal Intelligence, referenced a property in Bariloche, Argentina, a resort town in the Andes that became infamous as a refuge for fleeing Nazis. The property had been purchased in 1943 under the name of a Swiss trust. The trust's beneficiaries were listed in code, but the decryption key was included on the same microfilm. When analysts ran the names, 3 matched SS officers who had officially died in Berlin in April 1945, except they hadn't. Records showed that all 3 had entered Argentina on falsified Red Cross travel documents between 1947 and 1949. They lived under assumed names. They died of natural causes in the 1970s and 1980s. And their estates, modest by any standard, were settled through local probate courts without international scrutiny. But the Bariloche property was never part of those estates. It had been transferred in 1951 to another entity, which transferred it again in 1968 and again in 1995. Each time, the ownership chain passed through jurisdictions with strict banking secrecy laws. Each time the paper trail went cold, until the microfilm, because the microfilm didn't just list assets, it listed control mechanisms, passwords, signatory protocols, instructions for accessing accounts that had been deliberately obscured through layered trusts and dummy corporations. The documents were a map, and the gold was just the first landmark. In 2021, a joint task force, Norwegian Economic Crime Authority, German BKA, and Interpol, began tracing the financial networks identified in the microfilm. They weren't investigating war crimes. The statute of limitations had long since expired, and most of the individuals involved were dead. They were investigating money laundering, tax evasion, and the possibility that Nazi-era assets were still circulating in the global financial system. What they found was worse than they expected. Not because the amounts were staggering, they weren't. Adjusted for inflation, the total value of traceable assets was in the low hundreds of millions, significant but not world-changing. The problem was continuity. These weren't dormant accounts, they were active, managed, generating returns. One account, held at a private bank in Liechtenstein, had been opened in 1944 with a deposit of 200,000 Swiss francs, looted from a Belgian bank. Over 75 years, through reinvestment, dividends, and compound interest, that account had grown to over 12 million euros, and it had never been frozen, investigated, or claimed, because no one knew it existed. The microfilm changed that, but tracing assets is one thing, recovering them is another. The legal frameworks that govern looted art and Nazi gold don't always apply to financial instruments. If an account was opened legally, even if the source funds were illegal, and if the account has been managed in compliance with local banking laws, then proving ownership, let alone seizing it, becomes a nightmare of jurisdictional conflict. Some countries cooperated. Switzerland, under international pressure, agreed to audit accounts that matched the microfilm records. Liechtenstein opened investigations into 3 private banks. Argentina requested documentation from German prosecutors, but other countries refused. Not because they were protecting Nazis, there were no Nazis left to protect, but because opening those investigations meant admitting that their banking systems had been compromised for decades, that oversight had failed, and that money with blood on it had been sitting in vaults, accruing interest, while Holocaust survivors and their descendants fought for restitution. It was easier to deny the problem than to confront it. Back in Norway, the U-864 wreck site became something else, a symbol, not of gold or greed, but of what gets buried when history moves too fast to grieve. The Norwegian Coastal Administration completed the entombment in late 2023. Engineers used remotely operated vehicles to place a geotextile membrane over the wreck, then dumped over 160,000 cubic meters of rock fill on top. The process took 8 months. The result is a submerged cairn, a man-made hill on the seabed, covering an area the size of 2 football fields. U-864 is gone. Not destroyed, but sealed. The mercury is contained. The wreck is stabilized. And the 73 men who went down with the boat in 1945 now rest under stone, as if the sea itself had decided they'd drifted long enough. But the divers who went down, remember. Marcus Tran, the U.S. Navy chief who nearly got trapped in the cargo hold, retired in 2022. He gave one interview to a naval history magazine and said this: "People ask if I was scared. Yeah, I was scared. But not of drowning. I was scared of what we'd find. Because you go down there thinking it's just metal and mud, and then you see a boot, or a belt buckle, or a name stenciled on a bulkhead, and you remember that this was a war grave before it was a treasure site. Those men didn't choose to carry that gold. They were just following orders. And then they died in the dark, and no one came for them for 80 years. He paused in the interview, then added, "We took the gold, but we left the ghosts. The gold itself is now scattered. Most of it sits in secure vaults, awaiting final disposition through international claims processes that could take another decade. Some of it has been melted down, its Reichsbank stamps erased, the metal returned to the commodity market as if it were never stolen. But 10 bars remain in museums. One is in the British National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, displayed alongside a section of HMS Venturer's periscope and the patrol log from February 9, 1945. The placard reads, "Recovered from U-864, a reminder that wars are fought not just with weapons but with the wealth of nations, and that some debts can never be fully repaid." Another is in Bergen, Norway, in the Armed Forces Museum, next to photographs of the dive team and a scale model of the wreck site. Visitors can see it through reinforced glass, a dull yellow ingot stamped with an eagle and a swastika, and next to it, a printout of 1 page from the microfilm, a list of names, most crossed out, a few circled in red. The museum doesn't say who those people were. It doesn't need to. The circles say enough. But the recovery of U-864 did more than close a chapter of World War II. It opened a new field of underwater archaeology and forensic finance, a recognition that the ocean floor is not just a graveyard, but an archive. Since 2019, deepwater survey teams have been systematically mapping known U-boat wrecks across the Atlantic, North Sea, and Baltic. Not all of them carried gold. Most didn't, but all of them carried something: cargo manifests, code books, personal letters, equipment, and, in some cases, intelligence materials that were never recovered. And as deep-sea technology improves, autonomous underwater vehicles, AI-assisted sonar mapping, non-invasive remote sensing, more of those wrecks are becoming accessible, not for treasure hunters, but for historians. Because every wreck is a time capsule. Every wreck tells a story that ended abruptly and stayed frozen until someone with the tools and the will decided to go down and read it. The divers who recovered U-864's cargo didn't think of themselves as historians. They thought of themselves as technicians, problem solvers, people who knew how to move through cold water and bring heavy things to the surface. But history doesn't care what you call yourself. It only cares that you showed up. There's a tradition in the U.S. Navy diving community. When a diver completes a particularly difficult or dangerous recovery, they don't get a medal, at least not right away. They get a photo, taken on deck, still in their gear, standing next to whatever they brought up: plane wreckage, ordnance, bodies sometimes, or gold. There's a photo from March 2019. It's not official. It wasn't released to the press, but it circulates among dive teams, printed and pinned to ready room walls from Little Creek to Bahrain. It shows Marcus Tran and Eric Halvorsen standing on the deck of KV Stormbull, dry suits unzipped to the waist, helmets off, hair wet and matted. Between them, a wooden crate, lid pried open, yellow metal gleaming under gray North Atlantic sky. Neither man is smiling. They look tired, cold, older than they are, because they'd just spent an hour in freezing water, inside a wreck that tried to kill them, recovering treasure that was never meant to be found. And they knew Maybe not consciously, but they knew that what they'd brought up wasn't just gold. It was proof. Proof that some people tried to escape consequences. Proof that the ocean keeps secrets, but not forever. Proof that if you're willing to go deep enough into water cold enough to stop your heart, you can still find the things history tried to bury. The last entry on the microfilm, the one that intelligence agencies won't talk about, is a set of GPS coordinates, not 1940s navigation. Modern GPS, latitude and longitude, decimal format, which means someone updated the documents after the war, someone who had access to the microfilm, who knew what it contained, and who wanted to make sure that if the first cache was ever found, there would be a trail to the next one. The coordinates point to a location in the South Atlantic, roughly 800 nautical miles east of Buenos Aires, in water over 3,000 meters deep. No one has gone down yet. The technology exists. The political will does not. Because if there's another U-boat down, there, another cargo hold full of crates, then this story isn't over, it's just paused, waiting for someone to ask the right question, get the right funding, and send divers back into the dark. And they will, because that's what divers do. They go where light doesn't reach, where pressure builds and cold bites, where metal rusts and secrets sleep. They go because someone has to, because history doesn't surface on its own. You have to pull it up. If stories like this remind you that some things stay hidden until someone has the skill and the guts to bring them back, subscribe, because the ones we're covering next go deeper. Into ice, into mud, into wrecks that weren't supposed to be found, and machines that kept running long after the wars that built them were forgotten.